So, time travel. This is a separate topic from time, although obviously it's related. And really, it became sort of a fertile philosophical point of discussion because of a philosopher whose name is going to come up an awful lot in this metaphysics class, and that's David Lewis. David Lewis wrote a very influential paper defending the possibility of time travel against a bunch of problems that people had raised. And in response to this, people sort of tried to come up with new problems for it. And we're going to look at those today. It's a fun topic because you get to talk about all kinds of great movies and stories. But it's also a way to think about, it's related to a bunch of other issues in metaphysics, most notably personal identity and freedom, which we are going to talk about later. So it's a good sort of, it's a good way to connect a bunch of issues in metaphysics. All right, so time travel. Obviously, time travel is possible. If time travel is possible, there are two possible kinds of time travel. There's forward time travel and there's backward time travel. Forward time travel, well, and we see both of these in the Back to the Future movies. I'm going to be referencing the Back to the Future movies. So here is the Marty McFly timeline. I've skipped the third movie, even though the third movie is fun because it's way back in the 1800s. So basically, let's assume Marty's 18 or 17 or 18 in the first movie, which is set in 1985. That means he's born in 1968, same as me. So this is his life before he time travels. He's born in 1968 and he lives normally until 1985. Then, of course, he goes back in the DeLorean to 1955 and only stays in 1955 for a short period. And then he hops. So this is travel backward in time. Then, of course, he goes back to the future to 1955, and this is sort of 1985, and this is in between the two movies where his girlfriend changes from whoever she was to Elizabeth Shue, or I've forgotten, the actress changes between the first two movies. And then, you know, of course, at the end of the first movie, Doc appears in this future in a flying DeLorean and says, you know, where we're going, we don't need roads, and hops ahead to 2015. So this is a little, there's a little time in 2015. I can't remember, I think, I've forgotten the second movie. Does Biff get control of the DeLorean? I think he does, where he certainly gets control of the book, and he travels around a bit. But anyway, let's say Marty comes back to 1985 and then lives his life. We're going to ignore the third movie. So there's, he travels back in time, he travels forward in time. Let's talk first about traveling forward in time. So let's look at this jump, where he goes from 1955 to 1985. Now, let's say it takes him 5 minutes in the DeLorean. He's sort of in the time stream for 5 minutes. There appears to be an apparent contradiction there. He's in 5 minutes. It's both true that this is 5 minutes after this, and it's also true that it's 30 years in this year. So, or 100, suppose you travel 100 years in 1 hour. How can that be? How can it be both be, how can time have, the amount of time that passed be both 1 hour and 100 years, or 5 minutes and 30 years? And the solution to that puzzle is, and this is a distinction that David Lewis makes in this very influential 1970s paper called The Paradoxes of Time Travel, is he draws a distinction between personal time and external time. And you can see that distinction in this diagram. The external time is just the timeline, sort of objective timeline of the universe. And it's in blue here. Whereas Marty's personal time is like this. It goes from there, and then actually, well, of course, this diagram doesn't do a really good job, because you also have to sort of know that as we're going down, this is connected to this. So this is only like a split second. This is only a split second after this. So personal time would be time as you experience it. From a Marty eye point of view, this is immediately after this. And if he's wearing a wristwatch, probably a digital watch, 1985, it's like a second later according to that watch. So the personal time is like the time as you experience it and as your watch experiences it. Now, if you add that watch part, it gives you a way to deal with this question. Because if you draw this distinction between personal and external time and say time travel is when they don't match up, well, what about the slow pill example from the Stephen Law book, or cryonics, or Austin Powers? In Austin Powers, of course, in the first movie, they defrost him in the 90s, and he's frozen in the 60s, and they defrost him in the 90s. So as far as he's concerned, it was 1960-something, 67 probably, Summer of Love, and then it's 1990-something. I can't remember when the movies came out. Around 95, was it? So it's like around 30 years have passed. Has he time traveled? Has he traveled forward in time? In one sense, you might say that, given our distinction here, he has. But that doesn't seem right. It doesn't seem right to say that if you took a slow pill, as Stephen Law describes it, so that you just experience time slower, that you're time traveling. So what the writers generally conclude is that for it to be time travel, there has to be some kind of trip, and that means you have to not be in the same place, as it were, in the intervening years. So it can't just be that you're moving so much slower than everybody else. It has to be that there's a genuine discontinuity, that you disappear, like the TARDIS in Doctor Who, and reappear where you are. And this actually solves another puzzle, which is also a puzzle, another puzzle later on when we're talking about backwards time, which David Mellor talks about, of the boundaries between the time-traveling vehicle, like the TARDIS or the DeLorean, and the external world. How can they interact if time for one is moving one way, and if time is progressing in personal time going forward, whereas you're traveling backwards in time? It seems like electrons would be moving away when you need them to be moving towards you. So the boundaries problem is only really a problem if the time machine is in the time stream in all of the trip. Whereas if there's discontinuities, it just is here and then it is here, then you've solved that. The trouble with that is, though, if there are discontinuities, then there's a question of identity. If there's no obvious connection between this one and this one, how do we know that what's happened is that Marty has time traveled instead of Marty just ceasing to exist here and a being calling itself Marty appearing here with memories of being here? But what's the connection? There's a discontinuity here. That has to be explained. How can it be true that these are one and the same Marty? From a God's eye point of view, it's equally well explained to say that there are two different Martys living at different times, because what's the connection? So hopping solves the problem of boundaries, but it creates another problem of identity. Okay. Did Austin Powers time travel? No is the answer. because if he was actually wearing a watch, well, I guess you could freeze the watch too. But so you have to say more than the personal time and external time don't match up. It's not enough that your personal time slows relative to the external world. Now, interestingly, according to Einstein's theory of relativity, and this has actually been measured, albeit at microscopic proportions, it is possible to do something like slowing your personal time. The closer you get to the speed of light, the slower your time is relative to the external time. And this was actually a feature of the original Planet of the Apes movie. Because, of course, the famous, I'm about to spoil the original Planet of the Apes movie for you, so if you don't know this, you should probably leap ahead. But, of course, the twist at the end of the Planet of the Apes, the Charlton Heston Planet of the Apes, is he's on this planet and he thinks it's an alien planet overrun by apes. But as he's sort of traveling away from a community of apes to live his life out somewhere else, he comes around the corner of a beach and finds the Statue of Liberty half submerged in the sand. And what he immediately realizes is, oh my God, this is Earth in the future. And, you know, he collapses to his knees and says, what have you done? Oh my God, what have you done? Talking about the humans of the past. Well, we're doing it now. So that's what we've done. So how did it happen that he traveled forward in time so far? How is it that he hasn't aged much, whereas the Earth has aged presumably hundreds of years? And the answer is that he was on a spaceship that traveled very, very close to the speed of light, and it just did a big loop and came back. So time didn't pass much for him, but it passed a huge amount for the Earth. And that is theoretically consistent with Einstein's theory of relativity. Now, if you can understand the Paul Horwich article, he talks a lot about Gödel, and Gödel came up with a description of what space-time would have to be like for time travel into the recent past to be physically possible. Now, is our universe like that? I don't think people know. Probably not. And in fact, in David Lewis's article, he explicitly says, I'm going to tell you that time travel is logically possible. Whether or not it's physically possible is another question. But logically possible, given his theory of possible worlds, means that there is a possible world in which they time travel. Is it this one? Probably not. So we probably won't be able to. Features of the laws of our universe will probably mean that we can't, in fact, travel back in time. But what he's interested in is it actually possible, or is there a logical contradiction in the very idea? And his article is concerned with arguing, no, there's no logical contradiction. And apparent paradoxes that people have talked about in the past can have solutions, and we can get around that. So that doesn't mean that we can have it necessarily, but it just means it's not ruled out by logic. Okay, so he has to get rid of apparent logical contradictions, like the apparent contradiction, for example, in the third movie. Actually, I do remember this. In the third movie, he travels back to 1955 as well, and he watches himself on stage, doesn't he? Sorry, this is the second movie, not the third movie. So there is a bit in 1955 where there are two Martys, one above the stage and the other one on stage playing Johnny B. Good and then, you know, shredding a little bit too much for 1955. So there's an apparent contradiction that there are, or actually I'll get to that. That actually comes up in the Leibniz law, so that's a slightly different puzzle. Well, here's an apparent contradiction. Marty was born in 1968, and yet here he is alive in 1955. That doesn't seem possible. That's an apparent contradiction. But again, Lewis says, no, we can solve that with the distinction of personal time and external time. All right, so back to the puzzle of the two Martys, one watching from above the stage, one on the stage. How can there be two of them? How can you say, at this time, Marty is above the stage, and at this time, Marty is on the stage? Normally, we would say a way to explain change, actually this came up in McTaggart's argument against the unreality of, for the unreality of time. But there's a puzzle about change, you know, like a tomato goes from all green to all red. So we say the tomato is green, and then we also say the tomato is red. But you can't be green and red all over. So how is that possible? How can the tomato be green and the tomato be red? And the answer is, well, you index the properties. So it's not just green, it's green at this time. And it's not just red, it's red at this time. So it has the property green at this time and red at this time. And those properties are perfectly consistent. Being red and being green all over are not consistent. So that creates the puzzle. But being red at time, being green at time 1 and red at time 2 are consistent. You can have both those properties. So that's okay. So the solution is time index properties. Now, of course, that doesn't work if the time that we're indexing it to is the external time, because then we've still got the problem at 1955 in this day, Marty is above the stage, but at 1955, at exactly the same time, Marty is on the stage. Then it sounds like, oh, you've got a problem. But of course, what we've got to index it to is not external time, but his personal time. So we would say Marty at age 18 and so many days is on the stage, and Marty at 18 and a few more days is above the stage. Then it's okay, and we don't have a contradiction. One of the other puzzles about time travel is backwards causation, because what causes the memories? So this individual that appears in 1955 in the DeLorean and runs over one of the pines, so it becomes Lone Pine Mall instead of Twin Pine Mall. That's a problem that we'll get to in a second, because he actually changes his present. But you know, this person that appears remembers a moment before being shot at by the Libyans, you know, if you remember the movie, and watching Doc apparently be killed. So this guy has memories of that event that hasn't happened yet. So where do these memories come from? Well, they're supposedly caused. Memories are supposed to be real because they're caused by observing real events. So his memories here are supposed to be caused by something that happened way in the future. That's backwards causation. This causes this in the past. That can't happen. Surely the definition of cause is it can only happen forward. And Lewis just says, and this is where it's hard to actually talk about David Lewis's philosophy, because everything he says about one topic presupposes something he says about other topics. He's got papers on freedom. He's got papers on possible worlds. He's got papers on a very influential view on causation. And his view of causation, which we're not going to get into, is counterfactual dependency, which is one of the reasons he talks about possible worlds, because what explains counterfactuals is possible worlds. So if you want to talk about causation, you have to talk about counterfactuals, you have to talk about possible worlds, and so on. And his view of causation allows for backwards causation. And he says, I'm okay with it. And apparently the math of the laws of the universe is okay with it too. The only people who aren't okay with it are us people who intuitively it just seems wrong that causation could work backwards. Normally we think every effect has to be after the cause. That's just the definition of cause and effect. But if you get into the math or Lewis's view, then no, causation can work in either direction. And that helps to explain personal identity, because Lewis also has a view about personal identity whereby this is a part. First of all, Lewis, as we'll get to later in the course when we talk about persistence through time, Lewis is what's called a perdurantist. And I'll get into this in a little bit because this is actually covered in more detail in the Keller-Nelson article about presentism. But there are different theories about what it is to persist through time for any object, not just a human being, but for any object. What is it that makes this cup now the same cup as the one I brought here, let's say, an hour ago? And the different answers are, the perdurantist says that actually what the cup is it's a four-dimensional object. And what exists right now is not the whole thing. It's just a temporal part of it, a time slice of the object. And the whole object is a four-dimensional object. So to exist through time is to have temporal parts in different times. Now, how are they connected? And the answer is, according to David Lewis, is causally. So what makes this time slice of the cup part of the same four-dimensional object as the time slice that I brought here is that the existence of this is caused in some way by the existence of the former ones. So there's a causal connection. So what explains personal identity is that yes, this Marty is actually the same as this Marty, not just a completely different Marty that just happens to be identical with memories, because the memories are actually caused. Otherwise, you would have a puzzle of personal identity. Well, how is it that this person is the same as this person? Okay. Oh yes, I forgot this quote that I like from David Lewis. He imagines a time traveler, talking about a time traveler. So imagine Doc, of course Doc isn't really dead. So imagine Doc gets up, and because he's wearing a Kevlar vest, and says to himself, or says to Einstein, the dog, about Marty, he may even now be meeting his parents in 1955. The even now is weird because it's talking about here, whereas Marty is back here. But if you make a distinction between personal time and external time, that makes sense. It means he may, at 5 minutes after he traveled back in time in his personal time, he may be meeting his parents. Takes a while more than that, of course. And he shouldn't be meeting his parents because it causes all kinds of problems. We've already talked about the boundaries, how that creates a puzzle when you're going backwards in time. So time travel would have to be discontinuous. You can't have it continuing to exist like this. There's a whole bunch of movies about time travel, some better than others. A famously hard to follow movie about time travel is one called Primer. It's a very good movie considering how little it cost to make. It was made for practically nothing. But it has just it just has the wrong view about time travel. And it has a view about time travel that involves changing the past. That's part of the plot. Now, being able to change the past makes for great movie plots. If you weren't able to change the past, then I think you could do Back to the Future without it, but you wouldn't have the weird fading out in the photograph, which makes no sense. If you think at all about the family photograph that Marty has, where when he's caused his parents not to meet cute in the way that they did, although it's not really cute because his dad was a creep, then it starts to cause problems in the future because they're not going to have the children that ends up with Marty. But Marty exists because he's there. So clearly they did have the children. So what's happening in the family photo? It makes no sense. And Primer has something of that. It's worth seeing. I mean, once you see it, though, you have to go and watch a YouTube video that explains it, because it's so complex, and it doesn't give you anything. It doesn't explain anything. It just, you know, you have to experience it as they experience it. But in that movie, what's interesting about that movie is the time machine is just a box, and it takes the same amount of time in personal time to go back like an hour. So you have to be in the box for an hour of your personal time to go back an hour. So that sounds like it would have the boundaries problem. Although, of course, they can't leave the box. And it's kind of hot, and it's all set up in a storage facility in Texas, I think. Anyway, all right, so causal loops. Here we go. There is actually a causal loop in Back to the Future, and it's rather an insulting causal loop. And it is, of course, Marty plays Johnny Be Good on stage. Listening is one of Chuck Berry's relations. And he gets on the phone and says, "Hey, Chuck, listen to this." And he holds up the phone. And obviously Chuck Berry hears this song. And the implication is, because this is before Johnny Be Good comes out, that Chuck Berry gets Johnny Be Good from Marty. And that's why we have Johnny Be Good. But then, wait a minute, why does Marty know Johnny Be Good? Answer, because he's heard it from Chuck Berry. So who came up with Johnny Be Good? And the answer is nobody. Marty copied it from Chuck Berry, who copied it from Marty. This is a closed causal loop, which sounds crazy, because it sounds like, well, wait a minute, where did Johnny Be Good come from? You can explain that at every moment by pointing to, so if you say, well, if you ask me, where did Chuck Berry get it from, I can answer that question. It came from Marty. If you ask me, where did Marty get it from, I can answer that question. He got it from Chuck Berry, from hearing Chuck Berry play it. But of course, this is circular, and it doesn't explain how it originated. An even more fantastical version of a closed circle, and these are popular in time travel movies because they're a fun idea. But the best instance of this in probably all fiction is a short story by the great science fiction writer Robert Heinlein called All You Zombies. And I put the reading, you can find it online if you search hard enough, and I put the reading on Canvas. And if you don't want to read the story, it was filmed as a movie called Predestination. Although they added something at the end that kind of ruined it. Because the Heinlein story is entirely consistent. David Lewis explicitly name checks this and another one that Heinlein wrote called By His Bootstraps as both consistent versions of causal loops, where there's nothing actually paradoxical about it. Because, I mean, there's something puzzling about it. You say, well, where did the causal loop come from? And David Lewis says, well, that's like asking, where did the universe come from? Or why does a radioactive particle decay? It just does. So the causal loop is just something that exists. And asking where it came from, you're not going to get an answer, which is very unsatisfactory. But David Lewis says, that's just the way of the world. I'm not going to give away the plot to All You Zombies because it's a good one. And watch Predestination, which has Ethan Hawke and Sarah Snook from Succession in it. It's kind of a fun movie. Okay, so according to Lewis, causal loops are weird, but they're not contradictory. But you know, a lot of features of the universe are weird. Relativity is weird. And Lewis, of course, is a realist about possible worlds, which as he says, gets him a lot of incredulous stares. So he's perfectly okay with believing strange things so long as there's no contradiction there. If you want in my view, the best consistent time travel movie, it's a Spanish movie called Timecrimes. It's not that pleasant, but it does the looping back on itself plot really well. And it doesn't break any rules. So it would have the David Lewis stamp of approval, except it came out in 2007 and he died in 2001. He died relatively young, I say, because he died aged 60, and it was because he was a diabetic and he just didn't quite regulate his diabetes, and his wife, who normally was very careful with it, was away on some kind of trip, and he just came home and died after a meal, after a talk at Princeton. Very sad, because everyone says he's a great guy, and he's probably my favorite philosopher of at least in my lifetime. Anyway, so causal loops without explanation, Lewis says, no contradiction, get used to it, it's weird. But here would be a contradiction. If you could literally do what Marty actually does do, because while he doesn't prevent his parents from giving birth to him, although of course he would, because they wouldn't have sex on exactly the sperm that produces Marty would not be the one that produces their child, given that they meet in a slightly different way. So that's another problem with Back to the Future. But there are some things that he literally does change, as, for example, the great detail that when he arrives back in 1955, he runs over a tree. And when he leaves the mall, it's called the Twin Pines Mall. But then when he comes back, it's called the Lone Pine Mall, because, of course, he destroyed one of the pines with the DeLorean. So he does make changes. And, of course, his dad is very different. He's successful and happy. His mother's thin because she's not with a loser husband, and so on. All of these things are different. So he does successfully change the past. But, of course, that is logically impossible. And the classic instance of this is, imagine autoinfanticide. You go back in time and you kill yourself as a baby. If time travel is possible, it should be possible to kill yourself as a baby. But if you kill yourself as a baby, you don't exist to kill yourself. So, contradiction. And what can you say in response to this? And what Lewis says famously is, you can't do it. Now, this is a very unsatisfactory to most commentators. What do you mean you can't do it? If time travel is possible, then I can do it. So if I can't do it, that means time travel isn't possible. And he says, no, it just means that you won't do it. And he says, actually, you can do it in the sense. So in other words, what he challenges is this claim that if time travel is, he challenges the part of the argument that says you can't do it. And he says, well, you can and you can't. You won't do it. And how do I know you won't do it? Because you're alive. So clearly you didn't do it. Nobody killed you as a baby. And you can't change the past. But then the question is, but wait a minute, if I'm going back in time, I am changing the past, because like, all of those Twilight Zone episodes that are spoofed in The Simpsons, you go back in time and you tread on a bug, and that bug would have caused something that would have caused something. And so merely by treading on a bug, you change the entire course of world history because it's so far back in time. And the answer is, if we can travel back in time, don't worry about it. Nothing you can do can change the past because the past has already happened. Now, the weird thing is the past has already happened with you in it. So if you travel back in time, history contains you because there you are back in time. Now that in itself is a bit mind-boggling, and that means that the very fact that we haven't encountered time travelers in our history gives us reason to doubt that time travel would ever be possible. Because if time travel is ever possible in the future, then they would have gone back in the past and we would have some record of it. I don't know if you remember, but a while back there was a picture and it was from like the 40s, and it had a guy in it who looked very futuristic, wearing these wraparound shades. I'll see if I can find it. And they said, well, look, here's evidence that we do invent the time machine because clearly this guy is not from the 40s. And sadly, he was from the 40s. He was just kind of a hipster who was dressing in futuristic dress. But that's the kind of evidence there would be if we ever get time travel, because if somebody ever in the future time travels back to the past, then they were there in our past already, so to speak. So let's look at this argument again. It says, if time travel is possible, then you could kill yourself as a baby. You can't kill yourself as a baby, therefore time travel isn't possible. That's a simple modus tollens, denying the consequent. It's a logical argument. Where Lewis responds to that is he says, I dispute the claim that you can't. Logically, you could, you just don't. And he gives an analogy. This is where we will get into this when we actually go to talk about freedom, because he has a similar kind of response to what's called the consequence argument that we'll talk about. But it seems like he's just playing with words here. But he gives an analogy. He says, look, can I speak Finnish? In some sense, I can, because I'm a human being and I'm not a lobster. A lobster can't speak Finnish. It doesn't have vocal cords. I have vocal cords, same as every Finnish person. So in some sense, I can speak Finnish. But if you ask me, do you know how to speak Finnish? It's no. So there's another sense in which I can't. There's a sense in which if I travel back in time and see myself as a baby, I can. But I just won't. And then how do I know that I won't? Because I'm alive. Now, this response seems to be a good response to that, because it says, like, he draws an analogy. Look, history is full of strange coincidences. For one of a nail, the shoe was lost. For one of a shoe, the battle was lost, and so on. Some things, like Donald Trump winning in 2016, all kinds of things had to happen for him to win. Probably that whole thing about Hillary's emails, if that hadn't come out, Hillary would have won. All of these factors had to happen. But they all did, and he did win. So if you look at it from Hillary Clinton's point of view, I remember before the night of the election, somebody said it's like 99% probability that Hillary Clinton will win. And of course she didn't. So from her point of view, it's like she was so close and yet she failed. We have experiences of this all the time. So you're going to have, if you time travel back in time for some kind of weird suicidal impulse, and you want to kill your baby self, sorry, you're going to fail. Now, this reply is kind of plausible unless you can keep doing it. And this is what convinces Horwich and Mellor that really time travel back, at least to our local past, can't be possible because well, here's Horwich's version of the argument. He says, there's a term called bilking that I think might have been invented, but it's certainly talked about by a great British philosopher of the late 20th century, Michael Dummett. And he imagines, so bilking is where you intentionally try to undo something that you know happened. And if time travel to the local past is possible, no matter how many times you attempt bilking, you will fail. So Horwich is convinced by this that therefore this makes it at least incredibly unlikely that time travel to the local past is possible. Because he says if space-time permits time travel, then men will travel into their local past. If men will travel into the local past, then there will be bilking attempts, because people are just like that. People have got to mess with stuff. Any such bilking attempts will be thwarted, because obviously they exist to attempt them. The regular thwarting of bilking attempts will involve an endless string of improbable coincidences. Therefore, if space-time permits time travel, then there would occur certain phenomena that we have empirical reasons to believe will not in fact occur. Therefore, space-time does not permit time travel. Now, what Horwich says is, well, best this shows that space-time does not permit time travel to the local past. It could permit time travel to the distant past, so we could travel to the past of a planet far, far away, and therefore we can't affect our own past. That is still left possible according to this argument. But it's a little disappointing. I don't think this ever convinced David Lewis, but I don't know his view when he died in 2001. Okay, now there's a different issue about time travel, and that is, suppose you think it's possible, do you have to have a certain kind of view about the nature of time for it to be possible? David Lewis is a four-dimensionalist. Now, four-dimensionalists believe David Lewis's view about time is the same as his view about possible worlds. That is, time is equally real wherever it happens, it's just not our time. So here is an indexical, just like the actual world in possible worlds is an indexical. So David Lewis is a big-time realist. He believes that that dinosaurs are real, they're just not now. But they exist in exactly the way that you exist, it's just they exist at a different time. Contrast that with an A-series, the A-series view of time called presentism. It's not the only A-series view of time, but it is an A-series view of time. Remember, the A-series talks about past, present, and future, whereas the B-series just talks about the timeline. So B-series just says, this is before this, whereas A-series says, this is the present and this is the past. Presentism says that the only thing that exists is the present. So the past isn't real. Now, it was real when it was the present, but it's not real now. Now, all that's real is what exists in the present. So it seems like a presentist has to be an endurantist, because remember, these are views about continuing to exist in time. And according to an endurance theorist, we are three-dimensional objects. So I exist all at once. This is me. This is all there is of me. There is no more of me. Whereas a perdurance theorist says this is a time slice of me. All of me consists of all the temporal parts in my entire existence. Some in the future, probably more in the past. I hope more in the past. I don't want to live till I'm 112. That would be too much. An endurance theorist, it seems like it would be crazy to be a presentist and a perdurance theorist, because what you would say is, I am an object, only a microscopic slice of which exists. Most of me doesn't exist. I don't know, you could say that. You could say, and perhaps some people think that, I am all of, like, there's an old joke where people come to a small rural town and they see a local leaning on a fence, and they ask him, have you lived here your whole life? And he says, not yet. Well, that seems to have a perdurance view, and if you're a perdurance theorist and a presentist, the only part of you that exists is the present one. But the whole of you includes mostly non-existent parts. That's a little strange. So it tends to be that if you're a presentist, you're an endurance theorist, that you exist. All that exists is what's in the present, and I'm entirely in the present. This is me now. Now, present endurance theorists do have a little stranger view of time, because going back to what happens in Back to the Future 2, where Marty watches himself on stage, it seems like there are two entirely existing individuals there, and they can't be the same one. Whereas a perdurance theorist says there's two different parts of one individual, and that's perfectly okay. Here's where my hand is one part of me, and it can touch my leg, which is another part of me. So my two different parts of me can come into contact, no problem. But can all of me come in contact with all of me doing something different? All of me exists and has the property of being above the stage, and all of me exists and has the property of being on the stage at the same time? That just doesn't seem possible. And in fact, Keller and Nelson say that if you're an endurance theorist who has a certain view of time index properties, if you remember, time index properties were a way to solve the tomato problem. The tomato problem says, how can the tomato be all green and all red when those properties are inconsistent? They say, well, no, they're not. They're all green at T1 and all red at T2 at a separate time. And those properties are consistent. Now, how do we interpret that? Well, according to the four-dimensionalists, so if we're talking in terms of predicate logic, this is a property, like being green, and this is the object that has the property. So Marty is above the stage, Marty is on the stage. Now, what is it that is indexed at that time? According to four-dimensionalists, it's the Marty himself. These are actually two different things. What is it that's different between the two? According to four-dimensionalists, it's Marty, because it's actually not all of Marty. It's not the same thing in both cases. This is temporal slice 1 of Marty, this is temporal slice 2, and they're as different as my arm and my leg. So that's why it's perfectly okay for one part of me to have one property and another part of me to have an inconsistent property. That's fine. What can endurance theorists say? They either say the same, they can't say that because it has to be entirely the same individual in both cases. It's 100% Marty, it's 100% Marty. So how can 100% Marty be above the stage and 100% Marty be on the stage? Well, you can either say these are two different properties that aren't inconsistent. Above the stage at time 2 is one property, and on the stage, above the stage, on the stage at time 1 is one property, above the stage at time 2 is a different property, and you can have two properties, like you can be tall and fat at the same time. That's okay. So that's one view of the endurance relativizer. Or you can say this at symbol is different. So in other words, I have the property of being above the stage at time 1. I have that in one way, and then I have the property of being on the stage, above the stage at time 2. I have that property, which is inconsistent with the first property, but I have it in a different way. And if you have it in two different ways, then it's not inconsistent. We'll get into this when we get into talking about this in more detail. Whereas the non-relativizer says what's different is the whole sentence. And they are saying inconsistent things if they're existing in the same time in 1955. So if you're a non-relativizer endurance presentist, you can't have you interacting with your former self. You can't make sense of it. So then you have to say, well, then obviously you don't do that. But you can travel to other times where you don't exist. That's okay. All right. I don't know how much sense that made, but I tried to make sense of it. So it is possible to be a perdurance presentist, but it's a weird view. It makes much more sense to be a perdurantist if you're a four-dimensionalist, because then you say, I am a four-dimensional object. All of my parts exist just at different times. You only get to see one time slice of me at once. God gets to see the whole thing. And it makes sense to be a presentist endurance. It makes less sense to be a four-dimensionalist endurance theorist, because then you could say, actually, yeah, it doesn't really make any sense, because the four-dimensionalist doesn't really think that there is an absolute presence. There is another view that we'll get into when we talk about Sally Haslanger's view. But all right, a more interesting puzzle for presentism and time travel is, think about it. If you are a four-dimensionalist, the past exists, so you can go there, in the same way that Spain exists, so you can go there. It would be kind of crazy if Spain didn't exist and you said, I'm going to go to Spain. And someone said, well, Spain doesn't exist. Yes, but it's going to exist when I arrive. How? Well, that does seem to be what the presentist is saying. If the presentist believes in time travel, then they're going to, only the present exists, and they're going to travel back to something that doesn't exist. Well, but when they get there, it'll be the present relative to them. And so presumably, though, I don't know, once you have traveling in time, are you in effect killing everybody because is the present relativized to you? Presentism, I'm sorry, it doesn't make that much sense to me. I mean, I get the basic idea, but it seems like there are all these puzzles. Now, what Keller and Nelson say is, look, here's the puzzle. You are traveling to nowhere because you're going to somewhere that, according to presentists, doesn't exist. But, they say, if presentism is to get off the ground at all, then it must have a solution to the nowhere argument. Why? Because when time passes, we're traveling to a moment that doesn't exist, because we're traveling into the future constantly, and according to presentists, the future doesn't exist. So time travel isn't a special problem for presentism. It's no different from passage of time, and we know that time passes. So if presentism makes sense at all, presentists have to come up with an account of how it is that you can travel to a time that doesn't exist, because we're doing it all the time. So there's nothing special about time travel. There's no special problem with time travel for a presentist, says Keller and Nelson. But my question is, well, there is, isn't there? Because in some sense, you could say time travel, if you're progressing in time, you're experiencing the universe creating itself all over the time. Whereas if you get to choose where you go to, in some sense, you get to decide what comes into existence. And that does seem qualitatively different from merely experiencing the future arriving. In some sense, you're not in control of the future becoming the present. Whereas if you get to, enter in your DeLorean, I want to go here, then in some sense you're making, as it were, Spain come into existence. So Keller and Nelson are discussing whether or not there are special problems about time travel if you're committed to the view called presentism. And the only concession they make is if you're a non-relativizer, then you can't just, already anybody who talks about time travel says that you can't kill yourself as a baby. Whereas the non-relativizing endurance presentivist has to say you can't even see yourself as a baby. You can't meet yourself as a baby because then there would be two of you existing at the same time, which is a contradiction according to them. But just as Lewis, it says, okay, you can travel back in time, you just can't kill yourself as a baby. Well, they say, well, maybe you can travel back in time, just not there, which is like what Horwich ends up concluding, maybe you can travel in time, just not to your local past. All right, so as you can see, time travel, it's got a lot of elements to it. It's got elements that we've already talked about in talking about A series and B series. It brings up issues of freedom. Are you free to kill yourself as a baby? And does maybe the idea of time travel just make all the more vivid a problem about freedom in normal existence? Because if we believe that it's what I will do tomorrow is already true, I just don't know it, then the future is like the past. The only difference between me traveling back in time is I know I didn't kill myself as a baby. But there's other things that are already true, like I won't win the lottery tomorrow, or I won't, go to Spain tomorrow. I won't go to Spain tomorrow. That's already true. Does that mean I'm not free to go? Everything that I do tomorrow, certainly if you're a four-dimensionalist, is already true. It's real. Does that mean that I am just running on a little track and I don't really have options about anything? Time travel makes that kind of vivid. So I can make that point about four-dimensionalism by saying, just as I can't kill myself as a baby, I have to do what I have to do. I have to do what I know I've already done because it's already in the past. Maybe all time is like that. And of course, there's also questions about personal identity. How can this be the same person as that? Time travel.